war.
In the blackness of the Atlantic
One of Hitler's
night,
most successful
long before
U-boat
radar
aces,
screens glowed
Otto
in
Kretschmer,
command centers,
sinks
long
dozens
before
of
the world
Allied
understood
ships.
the full terror of undersea warfare, a convoy of merchant ships plowed westward through icy swells. Their decks were crusted with salt and frost, their holds packed with food, fuel, ammunition, lifelines for a besieged island nation. Above them, the sky was moonless. Around them, the ocean seemed empty. But below, in the crushing depths where sunlight never reached, steel predators waited. This is Hell Below, Episode 1. The Wolfpack. The story of how Germany's submariners turned the Atlantic into a killing ground and
until a fateful mistake
Britain into submission. When war erupted in September 1939, the German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine, was not built to challenge the Royal Navy ship for ship. Grand battleships and heavy cruisers were few in number, and Germany's surface fleet was no match for Britain's global maritime empire. But one man believed that Britain had a weakness: its dependence on imported goods. That man was Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, a former U-boat commander in the First World War. He understood that Britain survived on a maritime artery stretching from North America to Africa and beyond. Sever those arteries, he argued, and Britain would starve. Donitz envisioned a campaign of ruthless efficiency. Instead of sending submarines, Unterseeboot or U-boats, on solitary patrols, he proposed grouping them into coordinated attack formations. When one submarine spotted a convoy, it would shadow the ships and radio their position back to headquarters. Other U-boats would converge silently through the night. Then, in darkness, they would strike together, overwhelming escorts and picking off merchantmen in a frenzy.
Their enemies strike back.
The British would later call this tactic the Wolfpack. At the beginning of the war, Germany possessed only a small fleet of operational submarines. Many were short-range coastal boats. Donitz believed he needed at least 300 ocean-going U-boats to truly cripple Britain. He had barely a fraction of that number. Yet even with limited resources, the early months of the war proved ominous. In October 1939, U-47 slipped into the British naval base at Scapa Flow and torpedoed the battleship HMS
The course of war.
The audacity of
Their
the attack
stories
electrified
are
Germany and
legend.
shocked Britain. The message was clear: nowhere was safe. As 1940 unfolded, events on land reshaped the naval war. Germany's lightning conquest of Norway and France gave the U-boats access to Atlantic ports such as Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire. No longer did submarines have to transit the heavily patrolled North Sea to reach hunting grounds. From these French bases, they could surge directly into the Atlantic shipping lanes. Massive concrete bunkers rose along the coast, shielding U-boats from air attack. From these fortresses, the Wolfpacks would prowl. The men who crewed the U-boats were volunteers, often young and fiercely loyal to Donitz. Life aboard a Type VII submarine was claustrophobic beyond imagination. 50 men crammed into a steel tube barely 220 feet long. The air reeked of diesel fuel, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Fresh water was rationed so tightly that bathing was unthinkable. Food was stored in every available space, sausages hanging from pipes, bread wedged into torpedo racks. As the patrol wore on, mold crept over provisions and condensation dribbled.
Nazi U-boat U-99.
Sleep came in shifts,
sunken Allied
often
merchant ship
interrupted by alarms. Privacy did not exist. Yet for all the discomfort, many submariners felt a fierce camaraderie. They believed themselves elite, hunters operating alone in hostile seas. When a lookout sighted smoke on the horizon, tension electrified the boat. The commander would order a dive. Klaxons blared, men scrambled down hatches, ballast tanks flooded. The submarine angled downward into darkness. At periscope depth, the captain would scan the horizon, calculating speed, distance, and bearing. Torpedoes were ready. A whispered command, fire, and compressed air hurled the weapon forward. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a distant explosion. Cheers erupted in the control room. By 1940 and into 1941, the Wolfpack tactic matured. Convoys crossing the Atlantic were vast, sometimes 40 or 50 ships in columns stretching miles. Escorts, destroyers, and corvettes zigzagged around them, sonar pings echoing through the depths. But early in the war, Allied anti-submarine technology lagged. Radar was primitive. Air cover could not reach the mid-Atlantic air
He
gap,
proves
a
ruthlessly
vast
efficient.
stretch of ocean
His
beyond
motto
the
is,
range of
one
land-based
torpedo.
aircraft. In this gap, the Wolfpacks thrived. Donitz's headquarters tracked convoy routes through intercepted radio signals and reconnaissance. When contact was made, U-boats formed a loose cordon across the convoy's path. At night, they attacked on the surface, where their low silhouettes were hard to spot. Running on diesel engines, they were faster and more maneuverable than when submerged. Torpedoes streaked through black water. Merchant ships erupted in flame. Survivors clung to debris in freezing seas as escorts raced
It's
to
only
counterattack.
Kretschmer's second patrol aboard the
The
recently
psychological
commissioned
toll was
U-99.
immense. Merchant sailors, many of them civilians, faced a nightmare voyage. A torpedo strike often came without warning, an explosion ripping open steel hulls, fires spreading across oil-slicked decks. In the North Atlantic, survival time in icy water could be measured in minutes. Convoy orders were brutal. Ships were not to stop for survivors if it endangered the formation. The Atlantic became a graveyard. One of the most notorious Wolfpack actions came in 1940 against convoy SC-7. Over several
With a displacement
nights,
of 940
coordinated
tons,
U-boats overwhelmed the convoys.
it's been adapted from commercial
Dozens
whalers
of
to
ships were sunk. The pattern repeated itself again and again. In what Germans called the happy time, U-boat crews racked up staggering tonnage. Newspapers in Berlin celebrated their exploits. Propaganda portrayed them as modern knights of the sea. But beneath the triumph lay peril. Each attack invited retaliation. British escorts dropped depth charges, barrels packed with explosives set to detonate at specific depths. When a submarine dived to escape, the ocean became a thunderous hell. Explosions
The British are
rocked
simply
hull,
not
lights
materially
flickered,
prepared for
gauges
it, nor are they
shattered,
psychologically
leaks sprang
prepared
from
for it.
rivets. Men clung to
And the
pipes
Brits have
as
to
the boat
adapt their...
shuddered. Silence was enforced. No unnecessary movement, no speaking above a whisper. The crew listened for the telltale ping of sonar. Sometimes the charges drifted wide. Sometimes they detonated with lethal precision. Technological innovation soon began to shift the balance. Britain refined ASDIC sonar. Shipborne radar improved. Escort carriers extended air cover into the Atlantic Gap. Long-range bombers like the B-24 Liberator
14
hunted
torpedoes
submarines
and a
from the
crew
sky.
of 45 men.
Codebreakers working on German naval ciphers
Germany
gradually
produces more of
pierced the
them than
secrecy of U-boat communications. Though the struggle was far from decided in 1941, the seeds of change had been planted. Still, in this first phase of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Wolfpacks ruled vast stretches of ocean. They operated not only in the North Atlantic but also off West Africa and even along the American coastline after the United States entered the war in December 1941. In Operation Paukenschlag, Drumbeat, U-boats struck ships silhouetted against city
And who
lights
deploys
from
the
Florida
U-boats
to New
is
York.
Karl Donitz,
The United States,
Hitler's mastermind of
unprepared for
submarines.
coastal submarine
I think the
warfare,
best...
suffered heavy losses. Tankers burned within sight of shore. Inside each U-boat, routine blended with terror. Days were spent charging batteries, repairing engines, calculating positions with sextants when weather allowed. Nights brought action. The captain's authority was absolute. A single miscalculation, a torpedo that ran too deep, a periscope feather spotted by an alert lookout, could doom the vessel. Communication with headquarters was a double-edged sword, necessary for
Donitz's
coordination,
U-99
yet
attacked the enemy
vulnerable to
alone.
interception. The
It has been
Atlantic
under
War
siege
was
for
one of
hours.
mathematics as much as courage. Britain needed to import millions of tons of supplies each month to survive. Donitz calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of shipping per month would force Britain to the brink. For a time, the Wolfpacks approached that figure. Merchant construction struggled to keep pace. Shipyards in Britain and later, the United States worked around the clock launching Liberty ships. Sturdy, mass-produced cargo vessels designed to replace losses faster than U-boats could sink them. As the
But as another
episode
salvo
draws
hits,
toward its first climax, we see the
man
duality
who
of the
commands
Wolfpack campaign. On one hand, it was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, small submarines threatening a global empire. On the other, it unleashed immense human suffering. Thousands of sailors perished in icy darkness. Entire crews vanished without a trace. The ocean swallowed them without memorial. By late 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had become the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War. The Wolfpacks had demonstrated their lethality, and Donitz's doctrine had reshaped naval strategy. Yet the tide was not fixed. Industry, intelligence, and innovation were gathering strength on the Allied side. The hunters would soon find themselves hunted. The ocean does not forgive mistakes. By early 1942, as winter gales lashed the North Atlantic and ice glazed the decks of merchantmen, the Wolfpacks pushed their advantage to its breaking point. The United States had entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and almost overnight the battlefield expanded. Admiral Karl Donitz saw opportunity in chaos. American coastal defenses were unprepared for submarine warfare. Cities along the eastern seaboard blazed with light at night, their skylines silhouetting outbound tankers and freighters like targets on a firing range. Donitz launched Operation Paukenschlag, Drumbeat, and the wolves slipped west. The early months off the American coast were a grim harvest. U-boats hunted within sight of shore. Survivors later recalled watching oil tankers explode in columns of flame so bright they lit up beachfront hotels. Lifeboats drifted past coastal towns as stunned civilians stared.
Kretschmer risks the last of his power on a course change in a final bid to escape.
System, and merchant ships sailed independently, easy prey for patient commanders. For the U-boat crews, it was a second, happy time. Radio messages back to France boasted of sinkings measured in tens of thousands of tons. Yet beneath the triumph ran a darker current. Each patrol stretched supply lines thinner. Type VII boats, the workhorses of the fleet, were designed for Atlantic crossings but not prolonged operations in distant waters. Fuel margins were tight. Spare parts ran low. Conditions aboard deteriorated as tropical heat replaced
When they
northern
surfaced,
cold.
the escorts have
Food
moved out of
arrived
sight.
quickly. Fresh water stank in metal tanks. Diesel fumes mixed with sweat and mildew in the airless compartments. The wolves were far from their lairs. Back in occupied France, the concrete submarine pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire thrummed with activity. Crews rotated through brief respites ashore, brief because Allied bombers increasingly targeted these ports. Massive reinforced roofs shielded the submarines, but the surrounding towns suffered. The war was encroaching on every sanctuary. Donitz, promoted and emboldened, pressed for more boats, more crews, more tonnage sunk. He believed the arithmetic still favored Germany. If shipping losses exceeded Allied shipbuilding, Britain would collapse. But the arithmetic was shifting. In shipyards from Glasgow to Baltimore, production surged. American Liberty ships slid down the ways at astonishing speed, sometimes completed in weeks. Where one freighter sank, another replaced it. The Allies began to organize convoys along the American coast, dim coastal lighting, and deploy more escorts. The wolves
Donitz
found
deploys
fewer solitary
U-99 from
targets
Lorient,
and more
France.
guarded formations. The tactical
Intelligence
dance
has
grew
learned.
deadlier. Allied escorts, destroyers, corvettes, and newly commissioned frigates tightened their screens. ASDIC sonar pings probed the depths with increasing precision. Radar sets improved, detecting surface submarines at night. The U-boats responded with discipline and cunning. They attacked in coordinated packs, shadowing convoys for hours, waiting for darkness or foul weather. A single boat would signal contact, transmitting convoy coordinates in coded bursts. Others converged silently.
34 enemy
When the
ships
attack
transport
came, it was
timber,
chaos.
steel, and other war
Torpedoes
materials
struck from
on a
multiple
convoy
angles.
from Canada to Britain.
Explosions ripped through hulls. Escorts darted toward the nearest contact, dropping depth charges in thunderous patterns. The sea erupted in columns of water. Beneath, submarines dove steeply, motors whining as they slipped toward the crushed depth. At 200 meters, hulls creaked ominously. Rivets strained. Every man listened for the fatal crack that meant steel giving way to pressure. The psychological strain on U-boat crews intensified. Casualty rates climbed. In 1942 alone, dozens of submarines failed to return. Each loss meant 50 or more men vanished into the Atlantic without grave or marker. Training pipelines struggled to keep pace with attrition. Veteran commanders, aces of the early war, were killed or captured. Replacements were younger, less seasoned, thrown into a campaign growing more complex and lethal. Intelligence warfare added another invisible layer to the struggle. Allied cryptanalysts were increasingly successful in penetrating German naval communications. Convoys were rerouted away from known Wolfpack positions. Hunter-killer groups formed around escort carriers, actively seeking submarines rather than merely defending convoys. Aircraft extended patrol ranges with improved navigation and weaponry, including depth bombs and new ahead-throwing weapons that allowed escorts to maintain sonar contact during an attack. In mid-Atlantic, the so-called air gap began to close. Long-range bombers like the consolidated B-24 Liberator swept over waters once considered safe for surfaced submarines. A U-boat caught charging batteries in daylight could be strafed and bombed before it had time to dive. Even at night, radar-equipped aircraft hunted them. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Despite mounting losses, Wolfpack operations continued with ferocity. Convoys such as ONS-5 in 1943 became brutal tests of endurance. For days, submarines and escorts clashed in storms that blinded lookouts and tossed ships like driftwood. Torpedoes struck, depth charges answered.
Another
By the
submarine
end,
to join the
both
hunt
sides had paid
is U-100.
dearly. Yet a pattern was emerging. U-boat sinkings were rising sharply, often exceeding the ships they destroyed. Technology raced ahead. The Germans introduced new torpedoes with magnetic pistols and acoustic homing devices designed to track propeller noise.
Driven to sink
For a time,
Britain's ships.
these innovations restored
The number
some
of
lethality,
aces
but
in the U-boat.
countermeasures followed swiftly. Allied engineers developed decoys, noisemakers to lure acoustic torpedoes away from their targets. Radar detection sharpened. Escort coordination improved through centralized command. Life inside a
New
U-boat
Wolfpack
grew more
tactic.
desperate. Patrols extended longer as hunting grounds shifted
Germany
farther
has
from
only
well-defended
27
convoys. Supplies dwindled. Morale fluctuated between grim determination and quiet dread. Letters from home, read and reread, reminded sailors of families they might never see again.
Convoy 7
Every
are
dive could be
protected
the
by only
last.
4 escorts.
The Atlantic had become not just a battlefield,
Their main
but a
weapon for
graveyard
detecting-
Germany's submarine arm. Admiral Donitz remained outwardly resolute. He believed technological breakthroughs, new submarine designs with greater underwater endurance, would restore dominance. Plans for advanced boats capable of sustained submerged speed were already in motion, but these were promises of the
His
future.
binoculars as
In the
his
present,
prize.
the Wolfpacks faced a relentless
Kretschmer is
adversary
treated
adapting
very well
faster
on
than
board HMS
anticipated.
Walker. He
By the end of 1942 and into 1943, the tone of the campaign had changed. Where once U-boat commanders sent triumphant radio reports of burning convoys, now messages grew terse,
War
cautious.
as an Allied prisoner.
Loss reports mounted. Entire Wolfpacks were scattered
battle
or
against
destroyed
convoy
by
HX-11
coordinated Allied responses. The Atlantic, once a vast hunting preserve, felt smaller, more perilous. And yet the war beneath the waves continued unabated. Each convoy crossing remained a contest of nerves and endurance. Merchant crews still braced for the sudden shock of impact. Escort
2.
sailors still
Cost
scanned
Donitz
dark
2 of his top
horizons for
submarines.
periscope wakes. Submariners still
Kretschmer and
whispered
Shepka
firing
go down
solutions in
in-
cramped control rooms, hoping their torpedoes would run true.